A passenger humiliated a black CEO mid-flight with an unprovoked attack. Minutes later, the truth about who he was made the entire cabin gasp. He thought attacking a quiet man would make him powerful. He didn't realize the one he hit built empires with calm precision. Subscribe if you believe dignity always strikes back. The golf club hit Darian's arm with a dull tap, not hard enough to injure, but enough to draw his attention and stillness. He turned his head slowly, eyes narrowing toward the man seated across the aisle. The brushed metal shaft had slid partially out of an unzipped bag wedged beneath the seat. It was a driver, glossy and black, its head tilted like an unwelcome guest peeking in. "Mind your space," Darian said, his tone calm, almost formal. There was no anger in his voice, but his words carried weight, measured and deliberate. Victor Rames shifted in his seat with a theatrical sigh and leaned forward, planting a calloused hand on the shaft. His other hand pulled the bag closer to him, but his gaze remained fixed on Darian. "Mind your tone," he replied, louder than necessary, his voice carrying through the first-class cabin like a dropped glass. Heads turned. The hum of idle conversation died down slightly. Someone coughed. Another man a few rows back leaned into the aisle for a better look. Darian didn't flinch. He returned his attention to his wristwatch, adjusted the strap, and leaned back in his seat. But inside, he was already categorizing Victor, not as a threat yet, but as a variable, unpredictable and noisy. Victor gave a short laugh under his breath, almost a scoff. He scratched the back of his neck and muttered to himself, "Always gotta act like you're in charge." It wasn't meant to be heard, but it was loud enough. Darian heard it clearly. Outside, the plane continued its smooth climb above the clouds, its engines a steady roar beneath the hull. A slight rumble of turbulence rolled underfoot, gentle but disorienting. Trays rattled softly. Darian closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his focus. He had been preparing for this investor summit for months, and he wasn't about to let a bored, bitter man derail that calm. He opened his briefcase with precise hands, retrieved his laptop, and opened a slide deck titled Coretin, Merger Vision 2030. His fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard, refining bullet points with clinical precision. From the corner of his eye, he could see Victor still adjusting his bag, still grumbling to himself like a man spoiling for attention. "You okay over there?" came a voice, a young male attendant leaning in from the galley trying to gauge the situation without escalating it. His smile was professional but tight, like someone used to minor disturbances on business flights. "All good," Darian said, not looking up. Victor gave a mock grin and nodded. "Yeah, just keeping my club safe. Don't want them banging around, you know." The attendant gave a brief nod and backed away. Victor settled back in his seat, but his eyes remained fixed on Darian's screen. His lips moved silently, mouthing some of the words on the slides. He wasn't reading, he was mocking. "Big plans," Victor said suddenly, nodding toward the laptop. "Merger stuff, right? Hope you're not betting too much. Markets don't like surprises." Darian paused, then turned the screen slightly away. "Appreciate the concern," he replied without inflection, "but I prefer not to discuss confidential business in public." Victor leaned closer across the aisle as far as his seatbelt allowed. "Oh, of course. Wouldn't want us regular folks overhearing the master plan." The sarcasm was thick. Darian exhaled slowly through his nose. His fingers hovered above the keyboard, then resumed typing. He didn't look at Victor again. But Victor wasn't done. "You people think success makes you untouchable." The words came like a dart, sharp and low but unmistakably hostile. A few heads turned again. The phrase hung in the air with a weight it didn't deserve, but couldn't be ignored. The man behind Darian looked up from his newspaper. The guy beside Victor subtly shifted away. Darian's hands paused mid-keystroke. His jaw tensed slightly. He'd heard the phrase before, more times than he could count. He let it pass like rain on a window. Power came not from reaction, but from refusal. Still, he could feel it building, the unease creeping up like pressurized air before a storm. Victor reclined in his seat with a smirk, pleased with himself. To him, silence was surrender. His eyes flitted back to his bag, to the club that had started it all. He adjusted it, then let his hand rest on its shaft like a knight with his sword. Not aggressive, not overt, just suggestive enough to be noticed. When the attendant passed again, Victor raised his hand. "Excuse me," he said, pointing toward Darian. "His attitude's making me uncomfortable." The attendant hesitated, clearly caught off guard. "Sir?" Victor nodded solemnly. "Just thought you should know. Some people think they own the row." The attendant blinked, unsure of how to respond. Let's all stay calm. We're still ascending." Darian said nothing. He met the attendant's eyes briefly, offered a professional nod, then returned to his screen. But inside, he knew what Victor was doing. It was an old tactic: undermine, provoke, flip the narrative. Men like Victor didn't want justice. They wanted dominance wrapped in victimhood. Victor grinned like he'd won something. He shifted again in his seat and muttered just loud enough, "Ain't nothing worse than a man who thinks he's above being checked." Darian closed his laptop slowly. The hum of the plane returned to prominence as silence swallowed the row. For a moment, all was still again, except the current had changed. Something dark now moved under the surface, like a riptide unnoticed by swimmers. The flight steadied. The lights above flickered briefly, unnoticed by most. But Darian noticed. He noticed everything. Not just the club, not just the smirk, but the timing, the needling, the performance. And he wondered, not whether there'd be another act, but what form it would take. What began as turbulence in the air would soon become turbulence of justice. Victor's elbow knocked the seat divider again, the third time in 5 minutes. Darian Holt's fingers hovered over his laptop keyboard, pausing mid-sentence. The turbulence had passed, but the discomfort had not. The cabin was steady now, lights dimmed to a soft amber hue, the low drone of engines humming like background static. Darian leaned slightly to his right, giving Victor space, though the man showed no signs of acknowledging the gesture. He resumed typing, his screen filled with notes for tomorrow's high-stakes merger presentation. Coretin Dynamics was about to announce its largest acquisition to date. If the vote passed, it would reshape the aerospace sector entirely. Every word on that screen mattered. Every detail had been agonized over. But as Darian adjusted his wrist on the edge of the tray table, a voice broke through the rhythm. "Figures you'd take up the whole row," Victor muttered, just loud enough to draw glances from across the aisle. Darian's eyes didn't move from the screen. He heard the words, but responded with silence, a silence sharpened by years of boardrooms, negotiations, and targeted assumptions. He knew the script of this kind of man, and he'd long since stopped giving it oxygen. Victor shifted again, the leather grip of his golf club squeaking against his palm as he adjusted it vertically between his knees, as though he were preparing for battle instead of travel. The seatbelt sign was still illuminated, but he fidgeted like a man itching to break something. A few rows ahead, a toddler giggled at a cartoon on a tablet. Behind them, an older man coughed twice into his elbow. But around Darian and Victor, the air had thinned. "I said," Victor repeated, louder this time, "you people think success makes you untouchable." The words sliced into the quiet. A middle-aged man across the aisle briefly looked up from his book, eyebrows drawn in concern. A young tech employee with earbuds in glanced toward them, one earbud dangling. No one said anything, but the tension had teeth now. Darian slowly closed the laptop without looking at Victor. His jaw tightened once, but his expression remained calm. Composure wasn't a performance, it was policy. His company's board had drilled it into him. No matter the pressure, no matter the insult, the CEO must never become the headline. He glanced down at the laptop screen before closing it, where the last words he typed read, "Prepare for turbulence, internal and external." The irony wasn't lost on him. Victor leaned slightly into Darian's space, just enough to make the closeness feel intentional. "You got nothing to say?" he asked, grinning now as if enjoying the silence more than any fight. "Must be nice, thinking you're too polished to respond." "All that money can't buy you spine." Still, Darian said nothing, but his stillness became a statement. His body language, shoulders squared, hands calmly resting on the laptop, projected an elegance that Victor clearly mistook for weakness. The aisle light flickered as the flight attendant approached. He was a tall, thin man in his 40s with a tired expression and a name tag that read, Mason. He paused beside them, voice courteous but cautious. "Gentlemen, is everything all right here?" Victor was quick to respond, gesturing vaguely. "I'm fine." But his attitude, "It's making me uncomfortable." Mason glanced at Darian, who remained seated upright, hands folded now on top of the closed laptop. He said nothing, his eyes meeting Mason's with an unblinking calm. "I haven't spoken," Darian said after a pause, his tone flat but firm. Mason hesitated, unsure. The rules of conflict resolution in the sky were blurry when no physical line had been crossed yet. He nodded slowly. "Let's just try to keep things peaceful, all right?" Victor leaned back into his seat, smug. "Sure, no problem here." Darian gave a single nod and returned his eyes to the seat back in front of him. He didn't need confirmation of what had just happened. He knew. So did the man across the aisle who lowered his book again. So did the tech worker who hadn't put his earbud back in. There was an invisible shift happening. The conflict wasn't loud, not yet, but it was gathering momentum. Small gestures, veiled jabs, public discomfort manufactured to provoke a reaction. Victor tapped his club against his boot, then against the side of his seat, each knock like a countdown. He was playing a game that Darian had seen before but rarely entertained. Provocation dressed as casualness, control disguised as commentary. Darian closed his eyes briefly, inhaling slowly. He thought of his late father, who once told him, "Let small men throw stones." But remember, even silence makes a sound when dignity is watching. He opened his eyes again, gaze steady. Behind them, a teenage boy whispered to his father, "Why is that man bothering him?" His father, a quiet man in a brown vest, shook his head and replied, "Some folks hate calm because it reminds them what they're not." Time passed slowly after that. The lights dimmed further, and the captain announced over the intercom that they would be cruising at 34,000 feet. But beneath that number, the cabin tension hovered just below boiling. Victor adjusted the strap of his golf bag once more. He seemed restless, but not anxious, more like a man rehearsing lines before a stage performance. Darian could feel it without looking. The attention, the pressure, the weight of being made into a spectacle without provocation. But still, he chose composure. Not because he was afraid, but because he was prepared. The man who'd built a company from the ground up had learned the value of controlled stillness. Victor didn't see it yet, but Darian wasn't ignoring him. He was outmaneuvering him in silence. And in that silence, the final shift occurred. Victor turned slightly, one leg angled into the aisle. He stretched exaggeratedly, then muttered again, "This plane's barely got room for real men." That time, no one responded. But the silence didn't serve him. It suffocated him. He needed reaction. He fed on discomfort. As Mason walked by again with a tray of bottled water, Victor smiled at him with mock innocence. "Still keeping the peace, officer?" he joked. Mason didn't smile back. Victor turned to Darian once more, but Darian was unmoved. He had written no words, but his silence had spoken volumes. The line had been drawn. The unspoken line between provocation and violence had been drawn. Patience, like a seatbelt, only holds until it's tested. The clang of metal shattered the quiet tension of the cabin. Victor Rames's golf club slammed hard against the armrest between them, the sound unnaturally loud in the pressurized silence. Heads turned. The sharp ring of metal on plastic echoed down the aisle like a warning bell. Darian Holt's eyes flicked up from his laptop, not in panic, but with the steady alertness of a man calculating outcomes. The flight attendant, a lean man with a receding hairline and nervous gait, rushed over. "Sir, please remain seated." "There's no reason to." Victor was already rising from his seat, half standing, his frame casting a shadow over Darian. His hand clutched the club near the head instead of the grip, knuckles pale, forearm trembling not with fear, but something more primitive, resentment. "You think you're better than me?" Victor spat. His voice was low but carried weight, the kind that quiets a room without raising its volume. Darian didn't flinch. He closed his laptop carefully, sliding it slightly toward the middle tray. "Please sit down," he said, voice firm but even. His fingers brushed the edge of the keyboard before retreating to his lap, palms open, visible. A gesture of restraint. Victor's eyes narrowed. The passengers nearby leaned back in their seats, instinctively creating distance. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was loaded. Then it happened. With no warning, Victor swung the club downward in one vicious arc. The head of it crashed against Darian's right shoulder, a sickening thud that sounded like it broke something more than just flesh. The pain shot through Darian like fire laced with cold. He recoiled, his chair jerking sideways as his laptop hit the floor with a mechanical crunch. A ripple of gasps swept across the cabin. "Sir, stop!" the flight attendant shouted, his voice finally catching up with his body. Darian gripped the edge of his seat, his other hand cradling the injured shoulder. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. His vision blurred not from pain, but from disbelief. He'd been in rooms where millions shifted with a nod. He'd stood before boards that voted on legacies, and yet here he was, assaulted mid-flight by a man wielding a club like a weapon from a medieval duel. Two passengers, a young man in a plaid jacket and a middle-aged accountant type, moved to stand, but Victor turned sharply, swinging the club slightly, daring them. "Sit down," he barked, his voice cracking with the intoxication of control. They froze, not out of agreement, but out of confusion. The flight attendant stepped back, fingers hovering over the intercom panel, debating between cabin announcement or cockpit emergency. Victor loomed over Darian, panting now, one hand on the seat in front of him, the other trembling with the weight of the club. Darian looked up. His shoulder throbbed with a pulse that made his fingertips go numb, but his eyes remained steady, dark and unreadable. He didn't reach for the call button. He didn't speak. He just studied Victor, taking in every twitch of his brow, every bead of sweat on his upper lip. There was something almost scientific in the way he observed the man, like he was decoding a pattern, solving a formula built on chaos. Inside, something deeper than pain stirred. This wasn't about seats anymore. This wasn't even about insult. It was about principle. He could hear the internal voice that had guided him through every hostile takeover, every late-night boardroom war, every betrayal behind corporate smiles. That voice whispered again now, not of retaliation, but of line crossing, of thresholds that once crossed cannot be undone. Restraint, it warned, not weakness, but discipline. Victor raised the club slightly, sensing perhaps that he'd gone too far but unwilling to step back. His eyes darted to the passengers watching, some filming, others whispering. He saw a stage, not a courtroom. And Darian? He saw a test, not of strength, but of identity. The seconds stretched. Cabin air felt thicker. The flight attendant called out again, but it was background noise now. Darian's breath steadied. He felt the pain, not as a distraction, but as a boundary marker. The club hadn't broken him, but it had awakened him. He rose slowly, shoulders stiff, legs steady. Victor didn't back away. He gripped the club tighter, perhaps expecting Darian to fight wild, to lose control, to prove every slur he'd muttered under his breath about men like him. But Darian didn't swing. He didn't shout. He simply stared. And that stare began to change something, not in Darian, but in Victor. The former sports manager took a half step back. His confidence wavered. He wasn't looking at a victim anymore. He was looking at a man who had chosen to absorb the first blow, not because he couldn't respond, but because he was waiting for the right moment. And that moment was almost here. The plane rocked gently, an unnoticed reminder of the altitude, the fragility of their environment. Victor's club began to tremble, not from turbulence but from the hand that held it. A foreshadowing crept into the air like a storm front. Something was coming. Not rage, not chaos, but a reckoning. And in the quiet before that reckoning, only one truth mattered. Somewhere between humiliation and adrenaline, something in Darian shifted. He no longer saw a passenger. He saw a test of everything he stood for. When respect bleeds, retaliation breathes. Victor lunged forward, swinging the golf club a second time, harder, more recklessly than before. The movement cut through the narrow cabin space like a whip, catching the low ceiling light and casting a fast-moving shadow across the aisle. Passengers gasped, ducking instinctively. But this time, Darian didn't freeze. He stood. In a single, fluid motion, Darian's hand shot up and clamped around the shaft of the club just inches before impact. The force of the swing reverberated through his arm, but he held firm. There was no hesitation, only calculation. His eyes locked onto Victor's, not with rage, but with a terrifying calmness that stopped the cabin's noise for a fraction of a second. "You've made a mistake," Darian said, his voice low, firm, a quiet blade slicing through panic. Victor tried to yank the club back, but Darian's grip didn't waver. It was the grip of a man who had negotiated billion-dollar mergers and walked away with companies crumbling in his wake. It was the grip of a man who knew restraint, but also knew precision. And in that moment, restraint gave way to necessity. With a controlled twist of his wrist, Darian rotated the club out of Victor's grasp and turned it back on him. Then, without a word, he brought the handle down into Victor's ribs. Not wildly, not with fury, but with the exact force needed to stop the threat. The hit landed with a dull, heavy thud. Victor gasped and staggered backward, his hands immediately clutching his side as if the truth had struck deeper than bone. The metal club clattered to the floor. There was a silence, thick and total. It lasted no more than a heartbeat, but in it, the air held something electric, like lightning just before it touches the ground. Then the plane exploded with sound. Passengers cried out. A man across the aisle stood halfway, unsure whether to step in or step back. Others raised their phones, already recording. The air felt too tight, like the walls had suddenly closed in on all of them. The nearest flight attendant, a tall man with shaking hands and sweat forming at his temple, slammed his palm on the emergency call button near the galley wall. "Captain, we need security." "Now!" he barked into the intercom. Victor dropped to one knee, gasping like a deflated balloon, his mouth working for air that wouldn't come fast enough. His eyes were wide with disbelief, not just from the pain, but from the realization that he had lost control. He had assumed Darian would absorb humiliation quietly, like a sponge, that he would retreat inward, ashamed and silent. He had misjudged the man entirely. "I'm pressing charges," Victor wheezed, his voice ragged. The attendant knelt down to check his condition, torn between duty and disbelief. "Sir, stay still." "Help is on the way." Darian didn't move. His chest rose and fell with steady rhythm despite the ache blooming in his shoulder. He looked down at Victor not with satisfaction, but with something colder, resolve. He wasn't proud of the strike, but he wasn't ashamed of it either. His principles had limits. He had reached them. Across the aisle, a boy, maybe 10, no older, peeked from behind his father's coat and whispered, "Dad, did that man just save us?" The father didn't answer. He just stared at Darian. In the cockpit, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are diverting to Halifax International for an emergency landing. Please remain calm and seated." The hum of engines below suddenly felt louder, like the aircraft itself was carrying the weight of the moment. Outside, the clouds thickened, gray and low like bruises stretched across the sky. As the plane angled into its descent, Darian returned to his seat and slowly lowered himself down, wincing as pain spread across his shoulder. The golf club lay beside the aisle, untouched. No one dared to pick it up. A man from row 6 murmured, "He fought back, with control." Not rage. The whisper floated like a verdict. Behind them, Victor lay curled, still coughing, a single tear tracing down his cheek, not from pain, but from a realization that his power had been defied. For the first time in his life, he wasn't feared. He was seen. The attendant glanced toward the cockpit, then back at Darian, whose expression hadn't changed. No fear, no triumph, just clarity. In the middle of this suspended chaos, Darian's mind already raced through what would come next: media, legal drama, misinterpretation. But even that couldn't shake what he knew. He had not started this, and he had not bowed. The captain's voice returned. "Prepare for landing." Victor didn't speak again. He didn't have to. His silence said everything. For the first time, Victor looked small, caught not in pain, but in realization. Retribution doesn't roar. It calculates. Victor lay crumpled in the aisle, one hand clutching his side where the blow had landed, the other still trembling from adrenaline or pain. It was hard to tell. The golf club now lay forgotten beside him, a ridiculous weapon turned symbol of the chaos that had just erupted at 30,000 feet. Darian Holt, still seated upright, held his left shoulder stiffly. The torn fabric of his suit revealed the rising purple bruise blooming beneath. Blood darkened the cuff of his sleeve. The club had landed hard, but not as hard as the consequences now descending with the plane. The cabin remained frozen in a brittle silence. Conversations that once buzzed freely were now reduced to whispers, suspicion, and hurried glances. Some passengers whispered, "He went too far," while others defended, "He was provoked." An invisible line had been drawn through the fuselage, not just between right and wrong, but between restraint and retaliation. Tension hung in the air thicker than the cabin pressure. One young man in a gray hoodie, seated across the aisle, leaned toward the man beside him and murmured with quiet certainty, "He did what any man would." Darian heard it, though he didn't react. He sat still, every breath calculated. His mind raced, not with fear, but with clarity. This wasn't over. This was the first ring in a long chain of ripples. He glanced at the flight attendant, middle-aged, stiff-backed, struggling to maintain composure. The man wouldn't meet his eyes. Darian didn't blame him. In this moment, protocol had collided with morality, and the fallout had no clear manual. Victor shifted, groaning, voice rasping through clenched teeth. "He assaulted me. I'll sue him. I'll own this airline by the time I'm done." His words were weak, but loud enough to stir renewed whispers. He looked up at the crew member who hovered nearby and barked, "Aren't you going to do something?" Before the attendant could answer, another voice cut through the uneasy air. "I am." It came from row 17. All heads turned as an elderly man slowly stood, gripping the overhead bin for balance. He was thin but upright, white hair neatly combed, a traveler's coat folded on his arm. In his other hand, he held up a phone. His voice was clear despite his age, and it carried a calm authority that hushed the cabin. "I recorded the entire thing," he said, stepping forward with quiet purpose. From the moment the golf club hit his shoulder. The flight attendant blinked. "Sir?" "He hit first," the man repeated, this time louder. "You might want to review this before anyone accuses the wrong man." Darian turned slightly in his seat, eyes narrowing. He hadn't noticed the man before. Now, The stranger felt like a lifeline threaded through chaos. The man offered the phone without hesitation. "Name's Harold Niven, retired civil investigator. Force of habit, I suppose?" A few rows behind, a gasp of relief came from a passenger who had clearly been recording too, but didn't dare speak up until now. Others sat straighter, eyes darting toward Darian, no longer with judgment but with curiosity. The tide was shifting. Victor, still on the floor, shook his head. "That video doesn't show what he said to me." He was threatening. Harold didn't flinch. "I heard every word." "He didn't threaten you. You muttered something, and when he ignored you, you snapped. That's not self-defense. That's ego in a tailspin." The attendant took the phone, his hands shaking slightly, and stepped toward the galley to alert the captain. In the silence that followed, a strange kind of clarity settled in the cabin. Everyone had seen the same scene, but now they knew where the truth began. Darian remained still, his shoulder aching, but his thoughts sharper than ever. He understood what was happening. This wasn't just about a man lashing out in mid-air rage. This was about perception. A black man in a suit fighting back would always draw more attention than the first swing of a privileged aggressor. And now, despite the truth, the consequences would spiral far beyond the aisle of this aircraft. The plane jolted slightly as the descent into Halifax began. The captain's voice echoed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our emergency landing procedure. Please remain seated. Medical personnel will meet us upon arrival." Darian glanced out the small window. Clouds slid past, a sea of white churning below. The roar of the engine softened, replaced by the rising murmur of passengers processing what they'd just lived through. A few turned their phones back on, preparing for whatever came next. Victor groaned again, more quietly now, his defiance shrinking by the second. He reached for the club, but no one moved to help him. The weapon that once gave him power now symbolized his undoing. Harold returned to his seat, nodding once at Darian as he passed. "Truth doesn't always walk fast," he said under his breath, "but it always arrives." Darian didn't respond aloud, but his gaze followed Harold until he sat down. Then he looked forward, gripping the armrest gently, not out of fear, but preparation. He wasn't afraid of what waited on the tarmac. He was preparing for the world beyond it, because the world would see headlines, half-written truths, images frozen out of context. But he knew what had really happened, and now, so did they. The plane was descending, but the story was just beginning. The wheels touched the runway with a jolt, the cabin shuddering as brakes screeched and the aircraft slowed to a crawl. The seatbelt sign dinged, but no one moved. The tension still clung to the air, thicker than cabin pressure. Outside, blue lights strobed across the tarmac. Within seconds, the front door creaked open, and the cold air of Halifax sliced through the stale cabin as two uniformed officers stepped inside, followed closely by a pair of paramedics wheeling in a stretcher. The lead officer, a tall man with a square jaw and narrow eyes, scanned the aisle like a hawk. "Where's the injured party?" he asked briskly, voice clipped and practiced. Voices erupted. Fingers pointed, some toward Darian, others at Victor, who groaned from the floor, clutching his ribs dramatically. Darian remained seated, still and composed, one hand resting on the fallen golf club now placed beside the aisle. His suit was smeared with blood from the earlier strike, the collar torn slightly, but his back was straight, his gaze unshaken. The officer stepped forward, pausing at Darian's row. "Sir, we'll need to speak with you," he said, tone firm but not aggressive. Darian gave a slight nod. He rose slowly, ignoring the dull ache pulsing in his shoulder. His jaw was swollen, a bruise already blooming along the side of his face, but he didn't flinch. "Of course," he replied, his voice calm, deliberate. Behind them, Victor's voice cut through the rising murmurs. "He attacked me," he shouted, eyes wild and accusing. "It was unprovoked." The younger officer beside the lead shifted uncomfortably. His eyes darted from Victor to Darian and back, uncertain where to place the blame. But before the moment could spiral, another voice rang out, clear, steady, and startling. "That's a lie," said Harold Niven, the elderly passenger who had watched everything unfold from 2 rows back. All heads turned as Harold stood, lifting his phone. "I recorded the entire thing," he said. "He hit first." The lead officer walked over, taking the phone from Harold. He watched in silence as the footage played. The moment Victor lifted the club, the brutal crack against Darian's shoulder, the chaos, the restraint. His eyes narrowed slightly as he handed the phone back. "Thank you," he said quietly. Victor, still on the floor, looked up in disbelief. "He manipulated you." "That video doesn't show what he said to me." "He said nothing," Harold replied firmly. "I was watching the whole time." The atmosphere in the cabin shifted. The passengers leaned in, hushed now, as the balance of power visibly began to shift. But just as a sense of clarity seemed to settle, a young officer leaned close to the lead, whispering something into his ear. The lead's expression changed, subtly, but enough for Darian to catch it. His jaw tightened, a flicker of hesitation dancing behind his eyes. "What is it?" Darian asked, though he already knew. The officer took a beat too long to answer. "Mr. Rames," he said slowly, "is related to Senator Wallace Rames. He's his cousin." A wave of quiet rippled through the nearest rows. The name carried weight, especially in a place like this. Political gravity could tilt even the most straightforward situation. Darian felt it immediately, that sudden, subtle shift where truth could be softened, bent, even buried. He exhaled slowly, locking eyes with the officer. "Then make sure this doesn't vanish in the wind," he said, his voice a mixture of challenge and calm. The officer didn't respond at first. His fingers tapped nervously against the clipboard tucked under his arm. The entire plane felt like it was holding its breath. Victor, now emboldened by the revelation of his family ties, lifted his head. "You have no idea who you just hit," he hissed, voice laced with venom and pride. But Darian didn't flinch. He turned his bruised face fully toward him, posture unwavering, gaze unwavering. "I know exactly who I didn't bow to," he replied. "Power without restraint is just noise." Darian stepped out of the airport's side corridor with 2 officers flanking him, handcuffed wrists held low but firm. Flashbulbs burst the moment the glass doors opened. A wall of reporters surged forward, their voices a tidal wave of questions. "Mr. Holt, why did you attack the passenger? Is it true you used a weapon? Do you have a statement for the investors?" The shouting grew louder, but Darian didn't flinch. His expression was composed, unreadable, save for the faint bruise blooming along the side of his jaw. He walked with the calmness of a man who'd already done his fighting, just not in the way anyone thought. Victor Rames, meanwhile, was being loaded into the back of a private ambulance. He clutched his side dramatically, wincing as paramedics lifted him. His ribs were bandaged, his shirt bloodied just enough for maximum effect. A camera zoomed in on his face. He caught it. Just for a second he looked straight into the lens and narrowed his eyes as if to say, "See what he did to me." The media latched on. Within minutes, the headline hit news apps and social media streams. Black CEO attacks white passenger mid-flight, golf club involved. The phrasing was slick, suggestive, half-true. Inside a secure airport lounge, Darian's phone rang over and over. He finally picked up. "Darian, it's Leon," came the voice of his communications director, half-panicked. "Say nothing." "I don't care who puts a mic in your face. Let legal handle it." We're coordinating a response. Darian looked out the window toward the blinking red lights of Victor's ambulance. "You think silence is enough?" Leon hesitated. "Right now, silence is the only thing that won't backfire. They're already painting you as the aggressor. There's no win here unless we stay disciplined." Darian didn't respond. The phone call ended without another word. Moments later, as the officers guided him toward the police vehicle, a reporter broke through the line. "Did you hit him first?" Darian paused. Not long, just enough to make the world lean in. His voice was even, neither defensive nor loud. "Check the recordings." He didn't look at the camera. He didn't raise his voice, but the sentence cut through the noise like a crack of thunder. At that exact moment, in a quiet corner of Terminal C, an elderly man named Harold Niven sat with his phone clutched tightly. His thumb hovered over the screen. He'd reviewed the footage twice already. It was crystal clear. Victor had been the first to swing, the first to shout, the first to strike. With a breath of decision, Harold uploaded the full video. The effect was instant. The first repost came from a college student seated in 14D. This is what really happened. Number Darian Holt. It had 100,000 views within 15 minutes. By the time Darian arrived at the precinct, newsrooms were scrambling to correct their headlines. Independent journalists began comparing the original reports to the video. The discrepancy was glaring. In the video, Darian didn't provoke. He didn't even raise his voice. He sat, composed, until the golf club came down on his shoulder. Then, and only then, did he rise and act. Controlled, defensive, measured. But truth has to race against lies, and lies have a head start. Inside the booking area, the atmosphere was tense. Officers glanced at Darian, some with curiosity, some with quiet judgment. The protocol was mechanical: fingerprints, photo, form, but the conversation was shifting just outside those walls. At a local diner, two retired pilots debated over their coffee. "That ain't how he looked in the footage," one said. "He didn't snap." He held his ground. At a newsroom in Manhattan, an anchor looked at his producer and said, "We need to issue a correction." Back on social media, the comments flooded in. He acted with restraint. Victor swung first. Why was he even allowed on with a golf club? And yet, at that moment, Darian still sat in a holding chair under fluorescent lights, waiting for a detective to process the truth. The price of dignity was delay. At Correttin Dynamics headquarters, employees gathered around screens. One young intern, barely 3 months in, muttered, "He did what any man would." Others nodded, somber, loyal. In Victor's camp, the atmosphere shifted from smug to silent. His lawyer, who had rehearsed the victim narrative, now scrolled through a feed that shattered it. The angle, the audio, the timeline. It was over. And still, no one had officially cleared Darian. That would come later. For now, he sat still, composed not because he didn't feel anger, but because he knew what it would cost to let it show. Outside, a protest was already forming near the terminal exit. Cardboard signs. Justice for Darian. Let the footage speak. Golf clubs aren't carry-ons. It had begun. Back in the lounge, Harold Niven watched the numbers climb. 1 million views. 2, 3. His hand trembled slightly. He'd done what he could. In a hotel conference room, a Correttin board member turned to the chairman and said, "We might have underestimated him." But Darian, cuffed and silent, knew one thing. Public opinion might sway, but power plays dirty. This wasn't over. He closed his eyes. The image of Victor's smirk still burned behind his eyelids. They had tried to break him in plain sight, but silence was not surrender. The world had misjudged the quiet. When the world misjudges silence, truth must learn to shout. He swung a golf club mid-flight, hitting the CEO in anger, unaware of who sat before him. If you believe cruelty always collapses under truth, hit subscribe now, because justice doesn't shout, it acts. The interrogation room was cold, not just from the air conditioning, but from the way everything inside seemed designed to drain warmth: gray walls, metallic table, and a flickering overhead light that gave the space a twitchy rhythm. Darian Holt sat with his back straight, fingers laced calmly over the table. Across from him, Detective Callan Voss entered with a folder tucked under one arm and a coffee cup in the other. His tie was crooked, half loose like a man who had long stopped caring about appearances but still showed up every morning because the job didn't care either. Voss dropped the folder onto the table with a flat thud and sat down without a word. For a few seconds he just stared at Darian, studying him, not with suspicion, but with the tired eyes of someone trying to make sense of a puzzle he'd seen too many times before. "You're lucky there's footage," Voss muttered finally, cracking the silence like a tired joke. "Without it, you'd already be booked." Darian didn't flinch. He knew the game. "Luck had nothing to do with it," he said evenly. "That footage saved the truth." For now, Voss raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. "You think the truth guarantees anything?" He took a sip from his coffee, then pointed at the folder. "The senator's legal team is already outside. They want this handled quietly. Their word, not mine." Darian's expression didn't shift, but something in his posture settled deeper into the chair, like a man who knew the storm outside wouldn't wait for him to speak. He looked past Voss, toward the corner of the room where a single security camera blinked. Watching. Recording. "I'm not here to win headlines," he said. "I'm here to make sure what happened doesn't get buried beneath influence." Voss exhaled heavily. He opened the folder and flipped through a few photos, still frames from the onboard footage. One caught Darian mid-motion, hand wrapped around the golf club as Victor's eyes widened in shock. Voss tapped the image twice with his pen. "You could have broken his skull," he said bluntly. "But you didn't." Why? The question didn't land like an accusation. It came more like curiosity, genuine, weary curiosity from a man who'd seen too many situations and the other way. Darian's eyes narrowed just slightly, his voice steady. "Because I wasn't defending my pride. I was defending truth." The silence afterward felt heavier than before. Voss closed the folder and rubbed the bridge of his nose. For the first time, he seemed less like a cop and more like a man struggling to remember why he still believed in the badge. Outside the interrogation room, voices echoed. The senator's legal team had arrived with urgency, pacing, whispering to officers, pressing for decisions. But inside the room, the calm between Darian and Voss had turned into something more dangerous, understanding. Later that evening, as Darian waited in a holding room, his phone returned briefly under supervision, buzzed with notifications that came in waves. The footage Harold had captured had gone viral. Hashtags began climbing. Hashtag Justice in the Sky. Hashtag Stand with Darian. Hashtag No Privilege in Flight. His face, blood still dried at the collar, was plastered across screens, but not as a villain, as a symbol. Civil rights organizations released statements within the hour. Pilots' unions condemned the unchecked aggression on board and praised Darian's restraint. Even rival CEOs, men who usually stayed silent in the face of controversy, took to platforms to say what others were too afraid to. Darian did not retaliate. He responded, with control, with dignity. But none of that changed the fact that Victor still hadn't been arrested. He had been taken to a hospital, not a holding cell. Not yet. Darian knew why. Men like Victor didn't just fall. They were protected by invisible networks, status, favors, names that caused doors to open or cases to disappear. He knew better than to celebrate. This wasn't the end of anything. The door opened again. Voss stepped back in, his expression unreadable but not hostile. He tossed a folded copy of a printed news article onto the table. "You've got the crowd," he said, "but just so you know, men like Victor, they don't lose." Not really. They slip away. They reappear. They wait until no one's watching. Darian picked up the paper, read the headline quietly, then folded it back down. His voice was calm, but firm. "Then we make sure people keep watching." Voss gave a slow nod. Something in his weathered face softened. He didn't smile, but his next words were quieter. "You've got a long fight ahead, Holt." Don't think this footage closes the book, Darian stood. His shoulder ached where the club had struck, but he moved with the same deliberate composure that had carried him through boardrooms, takeovers, and now, this. I'm not looking to close the book, he said. I'm writing a new chapter. As the door closed behind him, the station's televisions continued playing the footage in loop, showing the swing that missed its target and the man who didn't swing back until it mattered. Still, Darian felt no triumph. He knew this wasn't the final twist, just the eye of the storm. And storms, he'd learned, always circled back. He stepped out into the cool night, lights flashing from across the street where reporters gathered. He didn't approach them. Not yet. The message had already been sent. Injustice doesn't retreat. It regroups. The boardroom projector clicked on, casting Victor's image across the long walnut table just as his golf club cracked against Darian's shoulder. The thud echoed through the high-ceilinged conference room of Corettan Dynamics like a judge's gavel. No one spoke. The replay looped again. Victor's snarl, the swing, the crash of the laptop. Darian stood at the front of the room, arms crossed, the bruise along his collarbone now faded to a deep yellow beneath his shirt. He waited. Across the table, Louis Granger, Corettan's chief risk officer, cleared his throat. "We're not questioning the facts, Darian," he said, eyes flicking nervously toward the general counsel. "But public perception matters. Some are calling it a brawl, not an assault. Investors are uneasy." Darian stepped forward, his shadow stretching across the table. "You think perception matters more than truth?" he asked calmly. "It's not about truth," said Conrad Vale, the board's media advisor, tapping his pen against a closed folder. "It's about optics. A temporary leave, 30 days, could show maturity, strength. It lets this cool down before the merger." Darian looked around the room. These were men who had stood by him through acquisitions, takeovers, and a decade of innovation. Now, they shifted in their leather chairs like boys unsure whether to stay loyal or stay safe. He picked up the remote and paused the video on the moment Victor's club hung in midair before the strike. "This," Darian said, pointing to the frozen frame, "is what you want me to step down for?" No one answered. "Optics," he repeated slowly, "shouldn't replace integrity." He turned off the projector. The room stayed silent. One by one, heads nodded. By the time the meeting adjourned, the matter was settled. Darian Holt would remain CEO. By noon, Corettan Dynamics released a formal public statement. It declared their full support for Darian and condemned violence against passengers in any form. The statement included a link to the unedited footage, ensuring that the public could see the full timeline of events. The language was measured but firm, and it ended with a quote from Darian himself. "Civility isn't optional at 30,000 feet or anywhere else." The response was electric. Employees across Corettan's global offices held impromptu signs that read, "Stand with Darian." Shareholders rallied on social media, praising the company's transparency. Darian's inbox flooded with support, not just from colleagues but from strangers, pilots, frequent flyers, even competitors, thanking him for not retaliating in anger, but in control. But while the public defended him, Victor Rames vanished. His legal team went dark. Reporters waited outside his Manhattan brownstone, but the windows stayed shut. Rumors swirled. Some said he'd left the country, others that he was recovering from broken ribs in a private facility. The media began speculating if Victor had been encouraged or even planted. Detective Callan Voss was already 3 steps ahead. At his precinct desk, Voss hunched over the evidence files. The video footage, the passenger list, and now, a copy of Victor's pre-flight clearance note. Something about it didn't sit right. The airline had a policy. Sports equipment like golf clubs had to be checked unless medically justified. Victor had handed over a note from a Dr. Stephen Caldwell citing chronic shoulder pain requiring ergonomic flexibility and access to personal equipment. Voss frowned. The note was dated 3 days before the flight. He called the listed clinic and asked for Dr. Caldwell. "We haven't had a Caldwell here in 6 years," the receptionist said. Voss leaned back in his chair, the cold weight of confirmation spreading through his chest. The note was fake. Later that afternoon, Voss rang Darian's office directly. "I need 10 minutes in person," he said. Darian agreed without hesitation. In the quiet of his office, Darian listened as Voss explained the forgery. "He went through the trouble of faking a medical condition just to bring that club on board," the detective said. "That's not rage. That's planning." Darian exhaled slowly. He wasn't surprised, only disturbed by the lengths someone might go. "What's the motive?" he asked. Voss shook his head. "Not clear yet. But this isn't random. The medical note was a prop. The club wasn't for comfort, it was bait. He wasn't expecting to win a fight. He was expecting to provoke one." Darian stood by the window, looking out at the skyline. Somewhere, someone had orchestrated this, planted Victor like a weapon disguised in a golf bag. But why? He turned back to Voss. "Keep digging. This doesn't end on the runway." The detective nodded. "You'll be the first to know." As Voss left, Darian sat back at his desk, staring at the paused frame on his tablet. Victor's club raised midair, his face contorted in fury. The image no longer looked like an attack. It looked like a performance. And performances had directors. Darian's mind began to turn, slowly at first, then rapidly, pulling threads, names, deals, and timelines. Something larger was hiding behind Victor's swing. Not a moment of anger. A setup. And setups always had sponsors. He leaned forward, pressing play again, watching the moment from a new lens. Not as a victim, but as a strategist. Every swing leaves a shadow, and shadows always point to the source. The call came just after midnight. Detective Callan Voss sat alone at his desk, the glow of his monitor the only light in the cramped precinct office. The case file on Darian Holt lay open in front of him, filled with conflicting reports, media spin, and raw footage that had already gone viral. He rubbed his eyes, ready to close the file for the night, when his phone buzzed, a restricted number. He answered with a grunt. "Voss." The voice on the other end was male, quiet, careful. "I work baggage handling for the airline. I can't say my name. But that guy, the one with the golf bag, he didn't upgrade that ticket himself. It was done through a proxy agency. Name might be Convergent Travel. Look into it. The payment didn't come from him." Before Voss could ask anything, the line went dead. He stared at the phone, unmoving. Something about the way the man spoke, the tension, the risk. It felt real, authentic. He leaned forward, pulled out his notepad, and scribbled the name down. Convergent Travel. It wasn't on any of the passenger manifests or itinerary documents. That alone made it worth investigating. The next morning, Voss met Darian at a quiet hotel cafe near the precinct. Darian sat with calm precision, sipping dark tea, his posture upright despite the healing bruise near his collarbone. "You look like you haven't slept," Darian said evenly. "I haven't," Voss replied, pulling up a chair and sitting across from him. He lowered his voice. "We might be looking at something bigger than a violent passenger." Darian didn't flinch. His eyes remained steady. "Go on." Voss opened his notebook. "You remember the agency that upgraded Victor Rame's ticket?" Airline records originally said it was a last-minute cash upgrade. That was a lie. The ticket was modified by a company called Convergent Travel, only they don't normally handle individual clients. They manage corporate accounts. Darian leaned forward, interest finally flickering behind his calm exterior. "I ran a background sweep," Voss continued. "Convergent's biggest client is a firm called Echelon Aris. Ring a bell?" Darian sat back slowly. The name wasn't just familiar, it was recent. We just beat them out for a $300 million tech integration contract with Vertex Aviation. They were furious, walked out of negotiations, swore they'd see us soon. Voss gave a dry chuckle, though there was no humor in it. Well, looks like they did. A chill passed between them, silent but undeniable. So this wasn't some angry man on a plane, Darian said, the weight of understanding settling across his shoulders. It was a setup. I believe so, Voss confirmed. Victor was probably promised something: money, leverage, protection. His job was to provoke you, get a reaction. On camera, Darian's expression darkened, but not in anger. It was focus, calculation. His hands folded over each other on the table. They wanted footage of me losing control, he murmured. Voss nodded. Instead, they got footage of you holding it. The words hovered between them like vapor. Darian exhaled slowly. This wasn't just personal humiliation. They meant to wreck the merger. Voss pushed a folder across the table. I've already started pulling subpoena requests. If we can link that travel agency's payment to anyone in Echelon, we'll have a corporate sabotage case. Darian didn't reach for the folder immediately. Instead, he turned toward the window, watching traffic move slowly through the city's early light. His mind was already 3 moves ahead. This wasn't about rage. It never had been. This was about reputation, about perception, about war without a battlefield. They underestimated you, Voss said quietly. Darian looked at him. They always do. The detective smiled faintly. You planning to go public? Darian shook his head. Not yet. I'm planning to aim. The rest of the morning passed with quiet resolve. Voss made arrangements to secure access to corporate emails through a warrant. Darian, meanwhile, left without ceremony, retreating not to hide, but to strategize. This wouldn't be a counterattack of noise and spectacle. It would be precision, documentation, exposure. He returned to his office later that afternoon and closed the door behind him. On the wall hung a framed photograph of Coretin's first prototype aircraft, a memory of building from zero. He stared at it for a moment, then opened a secure communication line to his legal team. Start reviewing Convergent's transactional history, he instructed. Find anything that smells of Echelon Heiress. We're going to burn the whole curtain, not just peek behind it. As dusk fell over the city, headlines still painted him half hero, half suspect. But he no longer cared for the noise. The real battle was unfolding in the shadows, where reputations were crafted, alliances bought, and wars declared through expense reports and camera angles. In that realm, Darian was ready. The truth doesn't need a weapon, it only needs patience to aim. The email thread landed like a thunderclap. Darian stood over his legal team's conference table, eyes fixed on the screen. The room was silent, but for the quiet hum of a ceiling vent. The subject line alone was enough to tighten every throat in the room. Sympathy shift, priority urgent. The body of the message was worse. Brant Corvin, senior executive at Echelon Heiress, had written to a travel intermediary instructing, "Ensure he's placed near our contact." The incident must be dramatic enough to generate headlines, but not lethal. Sympathy must turn. It was signed with Corvin's digital signature. Voss paced the room with slow, deliberate steps. "There's no way they can spin this as coincidence," he muttered, rubbing his chin. This wasn't just manipulation. This was strategic character assassination. Darian nodded, jaw set tight. They wanted footage of me snapping. That's why Victor kept provoking. It was never personal, it was rehearsed. The PR director, Marlene Crane, leaned forward, fingers twitching over his laptop. We have 2 hours before press outlets break the leak. We need a unified response. If we don't frame this ourselves, they'll frame us. But Darian didn't rush. He stood still, absorbing the gravity of what had just been uncovered. This wasn't about one man with a golf club anymore. It was about a corporation willing to orchestrate a public attack in the sky to protect its bottom line. The merger vote had been scheduled for next week. Echelon had known they were going to lose it, and so they had bet everything on destroying him instead. "We go public," Darian said finally. His voice was low but decisive. "No threats. No smear. Just facts." Marlene hesitated. "You sure? This could cost us more than we gain. The media might twist it again." Darian turned to him, his posture calm, unshaken. If an empire needs deceit to survive, it was already collapsing. In the next 2 hours, Darian's team coordinated a precise release, a chronological timeline, screenshots of the email chain, Victor's recorded confession from the deposition, and a press statement from Darian himself. The language was restrained but surgical. There were no accusations, just truth, laid bare like a scalpel on the table. By the time the press conference began, reporters were already buzzing with the leak. Darian stepped onto the stage wearing a charcoal gray suit, the Project Ascend lapel pin glinting under the lights. He walked to the podium, no script in hand. "Good afternoon," he began, scanning the sea of cameras and flashbulbs. What happened on Flight 327 was not a random act of hostility. It was an orchestrated attempt to break a man through public humiliation. He let the silence settle. "I didn't break." The cameras clicked like hail on glass. Darian paused, not to gather thoughts but to let the moment breathe. "The emails you've received show an executive at Echelon Aris plotting to stage an incident you all watched unfold in real time. But today is not about vengeance. It's about clarity. If deception has become the cost of competition, then we're not building innovation. We're building collapse." The room was stunned. Even the harshest outlets couldn't twist the story fast enough. Hours later, Brant Corvin released a statement through a lawyer. He claimed ignorance, blamed a junior staffer, and resigned from his post. But damage had already rippled through the markets. Echelon stock dropped 17% in a single day. Their shareholders demanded accountability. Their board, silence. Meanwhile, Victor sat alone in a federal holding facility. The same man who had once sneered with smug certainty now stared blankly at the wall. During a private deposition, he finally spoke the words that would change everything. "They told me to make him snap," Victor admitted, his voice empty of pride. But he didn't. When the transcript was leaked, that single sentence burned across news tickers and talk shows. It wasn't just a confession. It was an admission that Darian Holt had done what few could, face public provocation and refuse to be broken by it. The statement became the title of every major headline the next morning, and in the court of public opinion, it was a knockout. When dignity refuses to break, corruption collapses under its own weight. Victor Rames stood before the judge, head slightly lowered, wrists cuffed, a muted glare behind his tired eyes. The courtroom was silent as the clerk read the charge aloud. Assault during an interstate flight, a federal offense. The words echoed off the oak-paneled walls like a final gavel. "Guilty," Victor muttered. His voice was flat, hollow, no longer defiant. Darian Holt watched from the gallery, seated in the second row, hands folded calmly in his lap. He didn't smile. There was no victory in this moment, only clarity. The case had stirred national attention, not because of the violence but because of everything beneath it: power, perception, and restraint. As reporters scribbled notes and photographers crowded outside, Darian remained still, his tailored suit crisp, his gaze level. Victor's sentencing was procedural now, but its impact reached far beyond the courtroom. It set precedent, and Darian knew that what came next would matter more than what had just ended. Later that week, inside the sleek steel and glass headquarters of Coretin Dynamics, Darian stood before a whiteboard, marker in hand. Around him sat a small group of legal experts, civil rights advocates, and airline safety officers. On the board, 2 words were circled and underlined: Project Ascend. The initiative, born from pain but guided by principle, had one mission: redefine how misconduct aboard aircraft was addressed, no matter the privilege or title of those involved. "We're not here to punish," Darian said, tapping the board. "We're here to prevent." His voice was even, but his eyes were sharp. Behind him, a display cycled through security footage of past incidents, not just his own, but others that had gone unpunished. His own story, though viral, had sparked a wider truth. Too many passengers had been silenced by fear or status. Project Ascend wasn't a public relations stunt. It was policy, drafted with urgency, reviewed by regulators and backed by those who once doubted him. The rollout was swift. Airlines began adopting new conduct protocols. A whistleblower clause was added to in-flight crew training. Even ticketing systems were modified to flag suspicious upgrade requests, like the one Victor had exploited. It was change not through outrage, but through design. 3 months after Victor's sentencing, Darian took the stage at the National Aviation Ethics Conference. The ballroom was filled with executives, journalists, pilots, and regulators. A large screen behind him displayed the words, "Restraint is strength." As the applause faded, Darian stepped to the podium. "I didn't come here to relive what happened," he began, voice steady. "I came here to show what we can build from it." He paused, scanning the room. Among the crowd stood Detective Callan Voss, arms crossed, face unreadable. He had come uninvited, slipping in quietly, dressed in his usual worn-out blazer. Darian noticed, gave the faintest nod, then continued. "Too often, we believe the loudest person in the room controls the story. But truth doesn't shout, it endures. The man who swung that club wanted a reaction. He got one, but not the one he expected." A ripple moved through the room. Darian let the silence breathe before continuing. "Project Ascend exists so that no passenger, no human being, is ever forced to trade their dignity for silence. Because restraint isn't weakness, it's the discipline that keeps justice from becoming vengeance." The audience rose in applause, not polite but thunderous, rising like a wave of vindication. Some clapped out of respect, others out of realization. In the back, Voss gave a single nod before slipping out the side door. After the event, Darian didn't linger. He walked alone through the side corridor of the convention center, away from cameras, into the cool dusk. His phone buzzed, media interviews, board updates, another keynote invitation. He silenced it. Tonight wasn't for headlines. It was for remembering. He sat on a bench outside, watching planes streak silently across the evening sky. Each contrail a scar of motion, each one vanishing into the same sky that once held his trial. A faint breeze stirred the air, and Darian inhaled deeply. The bruise on his shoulder had long healed, but the memory hadn't faded. And that was the point. He didn't want it to fade. He wanted it to guide. He pulled a folded sheet from his jacket pocket, a letter from a young pilot in training who had written, "Thank you for showing that standing still sometimes takes more strength than charging forward." Darian read it again, eyes unmoving. Then he folded it slowly, placing it back in his jacket, and stood. The night air felt lighter. He walked toward his car without speaking. Behind him, inside the venue, attendees were still gathered, discussing reforms, new policies, and future collaborations. He'd set something in motion, not a movement of anger, but of discipline. Not of noise, but of purpose. He had turned pain into blueprint, chaos into clarity. The skies remember every storm, but they also remember who flew through them. The seatbelt sign blinked overhead as the aircraft gently banked eastward, cutting through the high-altitude haze over Pennsylvania. Darian Holt barely felt the shift. His grip on the armrest was firm, not from fear, but awareness, a subtle readiness that had never fully left since that morning a year ago. This time, there was no Victor Rames across the aisle, no hidden smirks, no golf bags daring gravity, just a steady hush of engines, the soft murmur of travelers, and a seat assigned not by purchase but by recognition. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Holt," the attendant had said quietly during boarding. His posture was respectful, words measured, hands folded just above the waist. "It's an honor to have you with us." Darian had only nodded, his expression unreadable behind tinted glasses. He didn't ask for extra attention. But it came anyway, in the way the crew stood a little straighter, the way the captain tipped his head when he walked past first class. These weren't rehearsed performances. They were small apologies, quiet acknowledgments from an airline that once let things spiral above the clouds. As he settled into seat 2A, his eyes drifted to the laminated safety pamphlet tucked into the seat pocket. The design had changed. Gone was the standard company crest. In its place, embossed in silver and navy, was a new symbol, a rising arc intersecting a calm sky, the emblem of Project Ascend. Beneath it, in fine print, dedicated to safety, truth, and passenger dignity. He traced it with a fingertip, letting the silence speak louder than any speech. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't fought for legacy. Yet here it was, printed on glossy stock, folded neatly, handed to every soul who flew. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Good afternoon, folks. We're expecting smooth skies ahead." Darian smiled faintly at the phrase. Smooth skies. The irony wasn't lost on him. He turned toward the window, watching clouds drift past like slow-moving thoughts. The sun, pale and honest, reflected off the wingtip as if nodding in quiet approval. Across the aisle, a boy no older than 10 fidgeted with a toy plane, his father whispering reminders to stay calm. Darian glanced at them for a moment. A year ago, someone might have mistaken him for a threat just for looking too long. Now, the father smiled back and nodded. Times had changed, but they hadn't changed easily. His shoulders still ached some days, not from injury, but memory. The bruise had long faded, but its lesson had carved deeper. In the months following the incident, he'd been called many things: aggressor, hero, opportunist, reformer. Each label failed to capture the one thing he truly fought for: restraint. Not silence, not submission, but clarity under fire. From his jacket pocket he pulled out a worn envelope. Inside was a single sheet, folded precisely once. It was a printout of a message he'd dictated to Detective Voss months ago, meant for one person only: Victor Rames. They hadn't spoken, not directly, but Darian had felt it necessary to send a message, not of forgiveness, not of vengeance, but of understanding. "We both landed in different ways," it read. He hadn't expected a reply, and none had come, but he'd heard through Voss that Victor was now serving his sentence in a low-security federal facility in upstate New York. According to reports, Victor had started leading weekly anger management classes. The irony was stark, almost theatrical. The man who had once treated self-control like weakness now taught its value to others. Darian leaned back in his seat, letting the headrest catch his weight. He could hear the engines hum like distant thunder made tame. The sky ahead stretched wide and clean, free from turbulence, from storms, from shadows. His phone buzzed gently in his pocket, but he didn't check it. For once, the world could wait. Let the headlines move on. Let the next scandal chase itself. Here, in the calm altitude of reflection, Darian had earned something rare. Not revenge, not justice, but peace. He closed his eyes slowly as the plane tilted toward the horizon, bathed in afternoon light. Behind closed lids he could still see clouds moving, silent, steady, eternal. Some storms test your strength, others reveal it. He struck a man he didn't respect, and minutes later the balance of power reversed. If you believe arrogance always pays its price, subscribe now, because justice always takes the final swing. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, prejudice, and the moment power shifts from injustice to accountability. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage reflection on equality, dignity, and standing up against discrimination.